Bill. I am James Cassara, and as of about 10 minutes ago, I was enlisted to be the worship associate for this morning, and I am honored and delighted to do so. We're glad that you are here. Welcome to this morning, this day, and this opportunity to be together in community. It is a time of joy, comfort, and sometimes challenges. This Unitarian Universalist congregation is a place where we come to learn more about being human. We're not here because we have figured out life's questions or because we think we've got it right. Not even close. We come here to learn more about being in relationship together, how to listen, how to forgive, how to be vulnerable, how to create trust and compassion in one another. Let us move into worship, willing to be authentic with one another, honest within ourselves, and opening to connection in all of its many forms. Now, let us worship together.
I'm Reverend Cathy Harrington, and I'm interim lead minister of this congregation. The opening words this morning are by the Reverend Gretchen Haley, one of my favorite writers. The bright thread of hope. There is too much beauty in the world to give up on it yet, and it is always too soon to surrender to cynicism. Bring your doubt, your skepticism, your downright confusion, and even your bitterness. But in the midst of all these, in the center, wrap your tender fingers around that bright thread of hope. Feel it in your heart, that steady hunger for something more, the vision that we glimpse every day in the rising sun, across the foothills, the light that spreads across the face of the one we love, the look of knowing all there is to know and still loving life. loving us just as it is and just as we are. For this hour, come to celebrate, to praise, to give thanks, to refuse to give up, to steady ourselves as keepers of hope, brave builders of this still possible world. The chalice lighting this morning is from my seminary, Starr King School for the Ministry, and later on you'll understand why this is important to me. I forgot to light the candle. With the kindling of this flame, we reaffirm our commitment to accept our gifts with grace and gratitude and to use them to bless the world in the spirit of love. This was the chalice lighting that we used every day that I was in seminary. I spent 4 years in seminary and 1 year in my internship. So our wisdom story today is, I think we have a hymn. Sorry, we have a hymn. We're going to celebrate life, the web of life. It's good to be together again, so let us sing or hum, if you're in the sanctuary, hum. We celebrate the web of life. Sing by Hillary Trumpler.
We celebrate the web of life, its magnitude we sing, for we can see divinity in every living thing. A fragment of the perfect whole in cactus and in quail, as much in tiny barnacle as in the great blue whale. Of ancient dreams we are the sum, our bones link stone to star, and bind our future worlds to come with worlds that were and are. Respect the water, land, and air, which gave all creatures birth. Protect the lives of all that share the glory of the earth.
In today's story, I want to introduce you to 4 people who live in different parts of the world, but are all working with UUSC to help their communities have more justice and more resilience. Justice is another word for making things fair, and resilience means having the ability to heal after bad or hard things happen. Even though we don't have a chance to meet them in person, I want you to imagine they're coming over for dinner with you and your family. Think of them as a dinner guest, telling you an interesting story over a big plate of your favorite food. All over the country, other kids like you are imagining the same dinner party and learning about the same people as part of a program called Guest at Your Table. The program is a chance to learn about 4 courageous people making a difference in their communities. This year, the 4 people we're going to meet are Axel, Myra, Maina, and Christian. First, I want to introduce you to Axel, who lives in Missouri. Axel works with the people who work in the food processing factories in the Midwestern United States. Many of the food service workers Axel works with are immigrants and refugees. Without them, we wouldn't have a lot of the food we find in our grocery stores. They feed our whole country. But even though they have this very important job, Food service workers are often treated badly by the people that own the factories. They don't make much money, they are forced to work for a long time without breaks, and they had to work all through the COVID pandemic without many of the simple items that would have helped them be safer from the virus. To fight back against these unfair conditions, Axel is helping to organize people who work in these food processing factories so they can work together to get better working conditions for themselves and their communities. Next, I want to tell you about Myra, an activist who lives in the United States now, but she's originally from a country called Burma. Burma is also sometimes called Myanmar. When Myra was a little girl, her village was attacked by the country's military, and she was forced to flee her house along with her family. They weren't able to bring anything with them when they ran, and they all had to travel through the forest for many days before they reached the country next door. Eventually, Myra was able to move to the United States. Now that she is safe, Myra speaks out on behalf of the many people still in Burma who are facing the same military violence that Myra went through as a little girl. What Myra and her family went through was very scary, and making sure this kind of violence stops is very important to her. Myra is using her voice to call attention to what is happening to the people of Burma now. The third person I want to introduce you to is Maina Talia. Maina lives in Kiowa Island, which is part of the nation of Fiji in the South Pacific. Many countries in this part of the world are facing the impacts of climate change now. They are losing land to the ocean as sea levels rise. Kiowa Island has a higher elevation than many of its neighbors. This means that Kiowa Island will be a safer place to live as sea levels continue to rise. In order to prepare for welcoming new people to Kiowa Island, Maina and the members of the Kiowa Island Community Organization are working together to create community resilience by making plans and planting trees that will help the island withstand the forces of climate change. Lastly, I want to introduce you to Christian, who's from Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, many farmers have a hard time making a living because giant agricultural companies own the land, the farming equipment, and even the seeds. Christian and the other women in their farming cooperative are doing things a little bit differently. They care for their own land. They use traditional farming practices that do not harm the soil, and they plant a variety of different kinds of seeds that have been used by their communities for generations. This way of farming helps the land heal and helps women gain financial and social independence. Christian is helping her community build resilience from both climate change and violence against women with their feminist farming cooperative. I hope these stories were a chance to learn about the challenges this year's 4 guests are facing and how they are fighting for what is fair and for what is right, while also helping their communities become more resilient. Through Guest at Your Table, your congregation and other congregations around the country are helping provide the guests with the resources to do their work. Together, we can make a better and fairer world. Thank you.
Which leads us into the work of the congregation. Our community plate recipient for this month is Beloved Asheville. It is a joint project that helps to provide much needed supplies for those that are either homeless or at the risk of such. Supplies can include such things as bottled water, socks, this time of year gloves are most welcomed, easily consumed foods that are packaged well for portability, and anything that we can do to help that community. There is a box outside of our congregational building. Please take advantage of it and keep Beloved in your thoughts and minds, as well as your financial support. If you would like to be a member of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, please go to the website to learn more about UUSC.org. You can pick up your guest at the table boxes, such as this. And together, in communion, our church can indeed make that situation better. In case you're wondering what I'm talking about, I'm kind of wondering what I'm talking about. Here is a short guest at your table instructional video.
Did you know that Unitarian Universalists have been coming together for decades to support human rights through the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee's Guest at Your Table program? During this special program, UUs of all ages learn more about important issues and the groups, or partner organizations, UUSC works together with to advance human rights. Working with community-based groups like UUSC Partners is a great way to get help directly to folks after disasters like a hurricane, and helps make sure the needs that are most important to communities are being met. UUSC works with more than 50 partner organizations around the globe, together responding to humanitarian crises, gender-based violence, persecution of activists, climate change, and more. Guest at Your Table is a chance to get to know our partners and these issues better through learning the stories of 4 people connected to UUSC partners as if we were sharing a meal together. They are the guests in Guest at Your Table. After getting to know the guests, UU spread the word about human rights and raise much-needed funds for UUSC partners. From supporting youth leadership trainings, to amplifying their voices to world leaders, to buying needed supplies after a natural disaster, our partners request our help with all sorts of projects that make a difference in their communities. Through Guest at Your Table, Unitarian Universalists form a mighty web that helps support UUSC partners in their important work. Thank you for helping keep this important tradition going strong and joining us in the Guest at Your Table program.
Supported by the generosity of all of us who join in. During this challenging time, UUCA continues the work of nurturing our spirits and keeping our community connected. Donations can be made via snail mail, by texting UUAVL to 73256, or on our website. For the gifts of your time, your talent, your presence, and your financial support, we remain grateful.
James is my hero. I just want to add, the UUSC, Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, is an international human rights organization grounded in the principles of Unitarian Universalism and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is member-supported, and they receive no funding from the UUA. So this is why our support is so important. It was founded in 1949, and they address the needs of those who have been previously ignored or overlooked, leading locally led initiatives, working hand in hand, eye to eye, and heart to heart in places where larger aid agencies do not. The UUSC has over 30,000 members, partnering with over 40 grassroots organizations with programs that span across 30 countries. I'm really proud of our UUSC organization. So now it's time to honor the silences of the world. Let us open our hearts to the place of quiet, to the silent prayer for the healing of pain and the soft, gentle coming of love. Before we enter our time of silence, I do want to share a prayer with you, written by a Unitarian minister who's probably passed by now, Harry Meserve. From arrogance, pompousness, and from thinking ourselves more important than we are, may some saving sense of humor liberate us. For allowing ourselves to ridicule faith of others, may we be forgiven. From making war and calling it peace, special privilege and calling it justice, indifference and calling it tolerance, pollution and calling it progress. May we be cured. For telling ourselves and others that evil is inevitable while good is impossible, may we stand corrected. God of our mixed up, tragic, aspiring, doubting, and insurgent lives, help us to be as good as in our hearts we have always wanted to be. May it be so. And now let us share a moment of silence. As we now listen to our meditative music, you're invited to type into the chat a joy or sorrow that you would like to share with the congregation. If you have shared a joy, know that this congregation rejoices with you. And if you have shared a sorrow, know that you are held in love and care by this beloved community.
Draw the circle wide. Draw the circle wide. No one stands alone, we'll stand side by side. Draw the circle wide.
Wider still.
From all the pain, it seems there's no relief. We will hold you until the storm subsides, and draw the circle wide.
Table, this theme this year is, now is the time for courageous change. Draw the circle wide. We are being invited to be courageous in this endeavor. And we live in a world where there are enough resources for everyone to have their basic needs met, and yet they aren't. Someone said, when I bring food to the poor, they call me a saint. But when I ask why the people are hungry, they call me a communist. What is it about our economic system that creates this paradox? What is missing in our global economy is a global vision with the human rights objective of basic needs for everyone. The theme, courageous change, is an important one because our world is filled with horrific inequity. Systems that are designed to maintain the status quo are all around us, and efforts to keep them in place are really strong right now. Modern technology has brought all of these truths into our living rooms, and sometimes it's hard to hold all of that pain. Climate change that affects so many around the world. It's hard. It's hard to hold it. Compassion fatigue. I know what that is. I know you do too. Reverend Mary Catherine Morin of the UUSC, she's the CEO, Executive Director. She says that the complicity of silence and the seductive comfort of our perceived powerlessness is tempting. Yet these times are urgent and are calling on us to remember to use our power. We have power. We have what we need, she says, to create a better world. We have what we need to effect courageous change. The UUSC believes that by partnering with grassroots partners who are most impacted by the injustices of the world is the most faithful and the most effective way to contribute to a better world. Mary Catherine Moore points out that the mission of the UUSC includes an affirmation of the inherent power and worth and dignity of all people. The power of faithful imagination and the refusal to give in to the cynicism and the powerlessness that tyrants and empires depend on to thrive. As you heard in the story, one of the partners for the guest at your table donations this year is Christiane Guzman Merlo. She is a part of an organization called FEM, Fundación Entre Mujeres, organized by and for the rural peasant women in Nicaragua. When I heard that, I was excited because I know a little bit about the challenges that they are facing in Nicaragua, because I've been there 4 times with the Faithful Fools Street Ministry. FEM is a farming collective and an advocacy network to empower women. I traveled to Nicaragua with the Faithful Fools in January of 2002 while I was still on my internship in Austin, Texas. The prerequisite for going to Nicaragua, this was the maiden voyage of the Faithful Fools, was having done a 7-day street retreat, which I had done many times while I was in seminary. I went 3 more times after that, 3 consecutive years. And I thought that my life was transformed by my first 10-day trip to Nicaragua. But I know now that my life is being continually transformed by what I have learned from the Faithful Fools and my experiences with them, and of course, life as the great teacher. Before founding the Faithful Fools Street Ministry with Unitarian minister Reverend Kay Jorgensen, Franciscan sister Carmen Barsotti spent 7 years living in a barrio in Managua, ministering to women and youth. Her job was to help fight domestic violence and to teach life skills. I felt really lucky to be a part of that very first immersion experience. Before going to the barrio, where we lived with our families for 4 days, and our first morning in Nicaragua began with a class at the Global Education Center. And what I learned about our own country's involvement in Nicaraguan history was disturbing. I learned that fair trade isn't really fair. And I learned that the United States military has been involved in Nicaragua since 1912. We supported the corrupt dictatorship of General Anastasio Somoza Garcia and his sons for over 40 years. FDR said Somoza is an SOB, but he's our SOB. The economy of Nicaragua grew under Somoza, but the corruption, especially after the earthquake in 1972, left the Somozas and the elite with huge wealth, while the citizens of Nicaragua suffered with poverty, illiteracy, and oppression. When the Sandinistas gained power, euphoria spread across Nicaragua, and Nicaragua experimented with an alternative economic model that combined capitalism and socialism. They experienced almost a complete solidarity in that country, and illiteracy rate was reduced in only 1 year from an average of 52% nationally up to 80% and 85% in some areas to 12.8%. The entire population was asking for volunteers, organized by asking for volunteers. 60,000 people volunteered to teach people how to read, and over 80,000 people participated. Newspapers were published in larger print so people could read them, and some people called it communism. The UN awarded Nicaragua a medal for the effort of a literacy campaign and health reforms, and polio was eradicated in a grassroots campaign. Within less than 2 months after the overthrow of Somoza, the CIA secretly formed a military force later named the Contras. With the support of the U.S. war, 60% of Nicaragua's national budget went to war. And under Ronald Reagan, the U.S. government aided the Contras, based in neighboring Honduras, and exerted economic pressures. The World Court charged the United States with violations for using a third country, and Nicaragua won. The damage award was $14 billion, but the U.S. refused to honor the jurisdiction of the court. FSLN leader Daniel Ortega was elected president in 1984, and civil conflict widened as much as the opposition boycotted the process. The Reagan administration became more open in its support of the Contras, increasing economic hardships. And by 1990, most Nicaraguans resigned to the fact that as long as the Sandinistas held power, that U.S. aggression would continue, and the costs were just too high. When I visited in 2002, the Nicaraguans were in survival mode. Most didn't hold much hope for the economic future of their country. Some found work in the sweatshops, but the workers were so desperate that employers exploited them and hired only young people. If you were over 35 years old, you could not get hired. Over 50% of the population was under the age of 25. This was a direct effect of the Civil War that killed 2% of the population. An equivalent loss in the United States would have been 4.5 million people. And then the earthquake in 1972 killed 10 to 20,000 people. Hurricane Mitch hit Nicaragua in 1998, killing thousands and wiping out entire villages and roads. Every family I met while I was there had lost a loved one in the war and were still grieving. I saw an uncommon dignity and strength in everyone I met. As in the streets of San Francisco with the homeless people, there was a deep sense of community. Like my first 4-day street retreat, I carefully prepared for the journey, packing and planning. And the night before I left for Nicaragua, I was putting the finishing touches on my newly painted red toenails. And my older sister was watching, and she said, "Oh, great, Cathy, the princess goes to Nicaragua. Aren't you concerned that the people there will think that you're showing up looking all flashy?" Big sisters have clout, so I was careful to pack only simple clothes, no makeup, and took off my toenail polish. But was I surprised when we got there and found that all the women in the barrio not only had makeup, but they had their toes and their fingernails painted. They must have thought we were slobs. By the end of 4 days, we were washing our clothes by hand in cold water, complete with soap, smudges, and wrinkles. But the personal pride and appearance of the people in the barrio in Nicaragua was amazing. They would even iron a crease in their blue jeans. Somehow, even with the dirt floors and the barrios and all the homes, their shoes were clean, white tennis shoes. It was amazing. There's so much to tell you about that experience in Nicaragua, my first time living in huts with dirt floors, bucket baths with cold water, chickens sleeping under my bed, listening to the roosters crow and the dogs bark all night long, as my host families slept like logs. The terrible poverty was balanced by this laughter and joy and happiness of the people. I didn't expect that. The conditions were primitive and hard, but bathing at a well with my Nicaraguan sisters in the country made me feel more alive than I had felt in years. I was so moved by the depth of pain and sorrow from the stories from the men who fought and survived the revolution and their friends that had died. It seemed as if hope had died in that war, but yet I witnessed joy, dancing, creativity, fun, I found people who had chosen a path of courageous and creative integrity, and it seemed to be true to me that no external force can destroy a people if at first it does not win the victory of the Spirit against them. The families in the barrios went all out to make us feel welcome, and they surprised us with a festive gathering that they had been planning for weeks. The children were dressed in beautiful handmade costumes, and they performed traditional dances for us, and they played recorders. They made us dance, and then they laughed at us when we were awkward. North Americans can't dance, they say, at least not the way the Nicaraguans do, with total abandon. We learned that. It made us feel free, and slowly we succumbed to the Nicaragua flow of being alive. My first family was a 37-year-old mother, single mother with 3 children, Mercedes. She was one of the women that was helped by Carmen's mission work. Mercedes had suffered from domestic violence, and she divorced her husband, who had been abusive. I admired the strength of her and her she was a dedicated mother. She had a store in front of her, in her home called a pulperia, and she also, believe it or not, sold Avon to her neighbors. I was a little angry at Avon for doing that. So our culture had sort of seeped into their culture, and in some ways had made people dissatisfied and unhappy with their lives. But they were enjoying life. The pulperia opened at 7 and closed at 10. The children helped Mercedes run the store and with the household chores, and she rented out 2 rooms in her house to a married couple. We all shared one toilet and a sink outside with 3 compartments to brush your teeth, to wash your dishes, and to wash your clothes. No one spoke English in this house, and I did not speak Spanish. It was exhausting. Fortunately, there was an 18-year-old girl across the street who spoke some English, and she had been hired as a translator for us. And after 4 days, we learned a lot about each other and found we had a common bond. My first night in the barrio, which was a Saturday night, I had trouble falling asleep because there was so much noise. Privacy was impossible in the barrio. I think I had just barely fallen asleep when I heard Mercedes filling water containers at 4 a.m. She got up every morning when she would hear the water flow to gather the water for the day, just like all the other women. The fancy hotels in Managua managed to have running water all day, but the barrio just had it for a few hours. And you never knew exactly when it was going to run, so they had to sleep with one ear open. 20 years ago, the Habitat International helped them because they're squatters on their land. They don't own the land, and there was no water or sewers. But the Habitat International helped them have electricity and water. One afternoon, we went on a tour. A gentleman took us to a garbage dump called the Shareka. People were living there, scavenging for food and items that they might sell or use. I was sickened by the smell and the dust, but mostly from seeing the children eating rotten potatoes, barefoot and filthy and sad. There were cattle with their ribs protruding, desperately fighting through the crowd of people to eke out a morsel of food. They told us that the people that live in the Chureka drink the milk from those cows. You could see the gases from the contaminated garbage rising in the air. We were standing there breathing it in, but these people were living in it. Broken glass was everywhere, and I saw a child with sandals on. The rest of them, only one child with sandals. The rest were barefoot. I'd never seen people living in such devastating circumstances. We were not welcome there. This was the first time that people had gone in there to observe. Someone saw us staring and threw something at us. The man who took us into the Chureka told us that he wanted people to see. He wanted people to know. But he had started a school for the children, and he taught them to read and write, and then some of them would go on to become hairdressers and mechanics. At that point, 30 had successfully completed the programs and left the garbage dump to make it on their own. Grassroots liberation. I fought back tears when I heard that they were being taught to be hairdressers. Some of you may remember that that's my first career. I was a hairdresser. It had been life-giving for me, and it was life-giving for these children. I survived and even thrived as a hairdresser and a single mother. I suddenly felt gratitude for the gift that I had been giving all those years, after years of feeling almost embarrassed by being a hairdresser, since I was the only child in my family who did not go to college. The next day, we drove north to the Campo, the country, to live with families in the poor community of San Diego. And again, we were welcomed by a party with a piñata and a game of pin the tail on the donkey. Again, we had fun, and we were amazed at the strength of the community in this village. They needed each other. Their way of life was simple and almost primitive, but they were resourceful and creative. They'd been taught to quilt by a Maryknoll sister a few years earlier and had formed a co-op to make items to sell. They didn't have many resources and had been taught only limited technique. The Peace Corps volunteer that was working with the families there was from Hawaii. She was trying to teach them to grow vegetables in their backyards and preserve their food by canning. Most of the water, their very, very scarce water, was being used for bathing and to keep the dirt floors packed down. So she was trying to teach them how to use their gray water to water their gardens. They were cutting down their trees. They had very few trees in their little village, but they were using the trees to cook and to heat, and their land was eroding. Because of the corporations and the dictator and the people stealing their land that they owned, they had unlearned. They had never learned the generational skills that are normally passed down to be able to sustain their lives. So having owned a farm, I had picked up a few skills along the way. I was a quilter. had taken the master gardener class. I had even become a commercial food processor so I could sell my home canned goods. Suddenly, I was beginning to discover all these life skills that I had, simple life-giving skills that I had taken for granted. I didn't have a lot of footnotes behind my name like all my other classmates and colleagues in seminary, and I kind of felt like, here's a hairdresser going to seminary. But suddenly, this trip made me realize that what I knew was life-giving, and I began to recognize my worth. We left the country and we visited a school in Managua where street kids were given a chance to get a basic education and learn a skill or a craft. At that time, over 1 million children were out of school in Nicaragua. It was because the IMF, because of all of the World Bank and the problems that they were having financially, they could not afford to pay the fee to send their children to school. So they begged in the streets. But these people started a school for them. And part of the educational program was to make beautiful hammocks, and some were taught woodworking, and others were being trained to be bakers. I owned a bakery. Once again, I saw that knowing how to bake bread was life-giving and life-saving skill. The bread and the cakes that these children made supported the school, the money that they sold. So there was only one loaf of bread left by the time we got there, and they cut it up for us to taste. But I noticed it was flat as a flitter. It was clearly overprocessed. It was hot and humid in Nicaragua, and I asked them, through a translator, did they use ice water to mix the dough? And the teacher said, well, no one has ever come to teach us this technology. Her words stay with me. The Faithful Fools had a reflection at the end of our time there at the volcano, at the top of a volcano in Masaya on our last day. Time to think, to write, to pray, to really think about what we had learned. So I climbed to the very top of that peak of the volcano to look down into the belly of it. There was a stone walk stairway going up to a large primitive cross there at the top. It was a monument to all the people who had died when this volcano spewed its lava. I spent 2 hours sitting there, writing and thinking. And what came to me, what kept coming into my mind was that chalice lighting that we had recited in seminary. With the kindling of this flame, we reaffirm our commitment to accept our gifts with grace and gratitude and to use them to bless the world in the spirit of love. I had been reciting those words for over 3 years, and suddenly I understood what they meant. Accept my gifts. I began saying the vow over and over again at the top of that volcano, yelling joyfully. I made the 20-minute walk down, and I never stopped repeating it over and over and over. I ran into my advisor's office, Sister Rosemary Kamichi, when I got back to Star King, and I said, I don't want to be a minister. I want to join the Peace Corps. And she said, oh, now wait a minute, calm down. Don't forget you have all these student loans. She calmed me down. But she told me, she said, what you had there on that volcano was a conversion experience. Remember, she was a Catholic sister. She said, I had accepted my calling. And it wasn't a supernatural experience. It was super because I didn't have to leave parts of me behind, right? But it was natural because it was who I was. The Faithful Fool's motto has always been, we have everything we need before it is asked of us. And there are many things that each of us uniquely have, gifts that we can use to bless the world. Mother Teresa said it's the small things, the little acts of love that make the difference. Just as we tend to discard pennies, the things that we think are not worth much, we also tend to discount the important gifts because we see them as small or insignificant. I was planning to do a year of chaplaincy before searching for my own church, but I was called by the Faithful Fools to come join them for a year, to work in the streets of San Francisco and with the rural people of Nicaragua. Well, it just didn't feel like that choice at all. I accepted immediately. My supervisor, Reverend Davidson Lohr, called it serendipity and a calling. He said there are two events that stand in life that stand out above all others. The first is a feeling that you have received a calling, and the second is answering it. And serendipity doesn't mean dumb luck. He told me the story of the brothers Serendip, which sounded as incredible as the conversion theory, so I checked it out on the internet. Sure enough, the word serendipity comes from a story about 3 princes of Serendip, who were always making discoveries by accident and insight of things that they were not even in quest of. People who were awake and alert, taking their lives and their world seriously. These things just popped into their lives. That's what serendipity is. It's being rewarded in a way that you hadn't expected for preparation you had made for a different kind of endeavor. I call it serendipity or call it grace. A wonderful coincidence? I don't know. Sometimes life offers us paths we never expected, paths that suddenly become the path we have been looking for all along without knowing it. I spent an extra year in seminary exploring my call, my vocation, and working with the Faithful Fools. My next 3 visits to Nicaragua offered a fresh way of seeing for me. I was ever more aware of how alive and strong and creative my friends in Nicaragua were. I discovered how organized they were and what tremendous accomplishments they had made alone by organizing. We are called in every moment to live life to the fullest and to use our gifts to bless the world. Howard Thurman once said, "Ask not what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive, and go do it, because what the world needs is people who have come alive." And with that kind of philosophy of life, by showing up that way, another world really is possible. Now is the time for courageous change. What gifts have you been holding back that you have thought weren't significant enough to make a difference? Think about that. In the words of Arundhati Roy, another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, you can hear her breathing. May it be so. And now let us lift our voices in song or hum if you are in the sanctuary. Closing words are from Andrea Hawkins Kemper. May we see all as it is, and may it all be as we see it. May we be the ones to make it as it should be. For if not us, who? And if not now, when? This is answering the cry of justice with the work of peace. This is redeeming the pain of history with the grace of wisdom and facing our truth of our history. This is the work we are called to do, and this is the call that we can answer now. To be the barrier and the bridge, to be the living embodiment of our principles, and to be about the work of building beloved community here in this place and around the world, and to be a people of intention and a people of conscience. May you accept your gifts with grace and gratitude and use them to bless the world in the spirit of love. May it be so. Go in peace and blessed be. Following the postlude, you're invited to switch to the Zoom link for a time of fellowship and virtual connection. I'll see you there in a few minutes. Thank you for spending your Sunday with us.